December 1944. Winter had fully taken hold of Europe. The Ardennes forest, stretching across Belgium and Luxembourg, was buried under thick layers of snow. Trees stood frozen and heavy, their branches weighed down by ice, while the ground beneath was hard and unforgiving. Every step made a sharp crunch, breaking the silence of a landscape that seemed almost lifeless. But beneath that silence, one of the most desperate operations of World War II was about to begin. The German High Command had prepared a bold and risky plan. Their objective was clear: launch a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes, break through Allied lines, and advance rapidly toward the port of Antwerp. If successful, this move could split the Allied forces in two and disrupt their supply lines, potentially changing the course of the war. But behind this ambitious strategy lay a critical weakness, one that threatened to destroy the entire operation from within. Germany was running out of fuel. By late 1944, Allied bombing campaigns had severely damaged German oil refineries. Fuel production had dropped dramatically, and what little remained was carefully rationed. Panzer divisions, once the pride of the German army, were now struggling to stay operational. Tanks that had once dominated battlefields were becoming liabilities. Without fuel, they were nothing more than lifeless steel machines. Despite this, Adolf Hitler made the decision to proceed. He believed that a sudden and powerful offensive could still turn the tide, or at the very least, buy Germany valuable time. The operation was launched on December 16, 1944. Before dawn, German artillery opened fire across the Allied front. The silence of the forest was shattered instantly. Explosions echoed through the trees, shaking the frozen ground. Moments later, infantry units and armored divisions began moving forward, advancing through the snow-covered terrain. The attack achieved its first goal: surprise. Allied forces were caught off guard. In several sectors, their defensive lines were broken, and German units pushed forward rapidly. Columns of tanks and vehicles moved through narrow forest roads, their engines roaring against the cold air. For a brief moment, it seemed like the German plan might actually work. But the deeper they advanced, the more dangerous their situation became. German commanders had been given strict orders: capture Allied fuel depots whenever possible. This was not just a strategic objective, it was a necessity for survival. Many units had been deployed with only enough fuel for the initial push. Beyond that, they were expected to rely on captured supplies. As German forces moved forward, they occasionally came across abandoned Allied supply dumps. Fuel barrels, trucks, and ammunition were found in these locations, left behind in the chaos of retreat. In those moments, it felt like a temporary lifeline. Engines that were on the verge of stopping roared back to life, and the advance continued. But it was never enough. The Ardennes terrain created its own set of challenges. Dense forests, narrow roads, and icy conditions slowed down movement. Vehicles struggled to maintain speed, and traffic congestion became a constant issue. Every delay meant more fuel consumption, and every extra mile increased the risk of running out completely. German supply lines were also stretched thin. Frontline units were moving forward, but getting supplies to them was becoming increasingly difficult. Meanwhile, Allied forces were beginning to recover from the initial shock. Defensive positions were reorganized, and resistance started to strengthen. In some areas, the reality of the situation became painfully clear. Tanks stood abandoned along the roadside, fully intact, but completely out of fuel. Trucks loaded with ammunition were left behind, useless without the ability to move. Soldiers were forced to leave behind heavy equipment and continue on foot through the snow, exhausted and under constant pressure. The further the German army advanced, the more fragile their position became. Weather conditions, which had initially worked in their favor by grounding Allied aircraft, could not protect them forever. Time was running out, and with every passing hour, their fuel reserves were shrinking. What had begun as a bold and aggressive offensive was slowly turning into a dangerous gamble, one where every decision carried the risk of total failure. Still, the orders remained unchanged. Advance forward, no matter the cost. By the final days of December 1944, the battlefield in the Ardennes had begun to change. What had started as a powerful and unexpected German advance was now facing growing resistance. The same weather that had once protected the German offensive was beginning to shift, and with it, the balance of the battle. For several days, thick clouds and heavy fog had grounded Allied aircraft, allowing German forces to move without fear from the skies. But as the weather cleared, the situation changed instantly. The sky, once silent, filled with the sound of engines. Allied fighter planes and bombers returned in full force. They targeted German supply lines, moving convoys, and key positions. Snow-covered roads that had once hidden advancing German columns were now fully exposed. Every vehicle in motion became a visible target. German soldiers quickly realized they were no longer safe. Whenever the sound of aircraft echoed through the sky, drivers abandoned their vehicles and soldiers rushed for cover. But in the open terrain, there was often nowhere to hide. Bombs fell with devastating accuracy, tearing apart convoys and igniting fuel trucks into massive explosions. Flames rose against the white snow, creating a stark and deadly contrast. This was more than just destruction. It was the breaking point of the German supply system. Fuel, already scarce, was now being lost faster than it could ever be replaced. At the same time, Allied ground forces began to regroup and organize their response. American and British units reinforced their defensive positions and prepared to push back. One of the most critical locations in this phase of the battle was a small Belgian town, Bastogne. Though small in size, Bastogne held enormous strategic value. Several key roads passed through it, making it essential for German movement. Capturing it was crucial to maintaining the momentum of the offensive. But when German forces reached Bastogne, they encountered something they had not expected: determined resistance. The American 101st Airborne Division had taken position in the town. These soldiers were already exhausted, many lacking adequate winter gear and supplies. Yet they were ordered to hold their ground. German forces quickly surrounded the town, cutting off all roads and supply routes. Bastogne was now encircled. To the German command, the situation seemed favorable. They believed the trapped American forces would eventually be forced to surrender. A message was sent demanding their capitulation. The reply was short and would become legendary. Nuts, it meant refusal. The fighting intensified immediately. Inside Bastogne, conditions were severe. Temperatures dropped well below freezing. Food and ammunition were limited. Medical supplies were nearly exhausted. Wounded soldiers had to endure the cold with little support, yet the defenders held their positions. On the German side, the situation was no better, and in many ways, it was worse. Fuel levels continued to drop. Tanks could not be moved freely. Every maneuver had to be carefully calculated. Units that had advanced too far now found themselves isolated, with little hope of resupply. What had been planned as a rapid breakthrough was turning into a prolonged and costly struggle. Time, which had once worked in Germany's favor, was now helping the Allies. With each passing day, more reinforcements arrived. Supplies increased. Air support became constant. The initial shock of the German attack had worn off, replaced by organized resistance and growing strength. German progress slowed dramatically. Roads became clogged with vehicles, both operational and destroyed. Narrow forest paths turned into bottlenecks. Delays became unavoidable, and with every delay came more fuel consumption. In several areas, German tank crews were forced to abandon their vehicles entirely. Engines still worked, weapons were intact, but without fuel, they were useless. Some were destroyed deliberately to prevent capture. Others were simply left behind, silent and motionless in the snow. For the soldiers, this was more than a logistical failure. It was a sign that something was going terribly wrong. Confidence began to fade. By early January 1945, the situation had become critical. From the south, General George Patton's Third Army began advancing toward Bastogne. This was a bold and rapid maneuver, one that caught German forces off guard. Patton had repositioned his army with speed and precision, aiming to break the encirclement. As his forces approached, the pressure on German units increased sharply. Bastogne, which had been expected to fall quickly, had now become a major obstacle. Instead of enabling further advance, it was slowing everything down. Allied counterattacks grew stronger and more coordinated. From both the north and south, pressure mounted against German positions. Units that had once been advancing were now forced into defensive roles. And throughout all of this, the same question continued to echo across German command lines. How much fuel is left? The answer, more often than not, was the same: not enough. It was becoming increasingly clear that the offensive had reached its limit. Advancing further was becoming nearly impossible. But retreat would not be easy either. The Ardennes forest, which had once served as cover, was slowly turning into a trap. By January 1945, the situation in the Ardennes had changed completely. What had begun as a bold and aggressive German offensive was now losing momentum with each passing day. The speed, coordination, and confidence that had defined the early phase of the attack were fading, replaced by confusion, exhaustion, and growing pressure from all sides. The sky, once silent, had become a constant threat. Allied aircraft dominated the air. Fighter bombers roamed freely, targeting anything that moved. German supply routes were under continuous attack, and convoys attempting to deliver fuel or ammunition were often destroyed before reaching the front lines. Without air cover and with limited anti-air defenses, German forces had little protection against these strikes. On the ground, the situation was even worse. German units were increasingly scattered. Communication between divisions had begun to break down due to difficult terrain, damaged infrastructure, and the chaos of the battlefield. Orders were delayed or lost entirely. In some cases, units were forced to operate independently, making decisions without clear direction from higher command. But the most critical problem remained unchanged: fuel. What had once been a serious shortage had now become a complete crisis. Across the battlefield, German vehicles stood abandoned. Tanks that had once led the advance were now silent, their engines cold, their fuel tanks empty. Some were left behind intact, while others were destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. Trucks loaded with supplies could not move. Artillery pieces were left in place, unable to be repositioned. The snow slowly covered these machines, turning them into frozen monuments of a failing offensive. For German soldiers, this was more than a logistical collapse. It was a psychological turning point. The equipment they depended on, the machines that gave them strength and mobility, were now useless. Every abandoned vehicle was a reminder that the situation was slipping out of control. Meanwhile, Allied forces continued to strengthen their position. From both the north and the south, coordinated counterattacks pushed against German lines. American and British units advanced steadily, reclaiming lost ground. The siege of Bastogne had been broken, and what had once been a German advantage was now becoming a liability. From the south, General George Patton's Third Army applied relentless pressure. His forces moved with speed and determination, striking at weakened German positions and forcing them to fall back. German units that had once surrounded Bastogne now found themselves under threat of encirclement. The initiative had shifted completely. German High Command faced a difficult reality. Continuing the offensive was no longer possible. But withdrawing carried its own risks. Many units were already deep inside contested territory, with limited fuel and damaged supply lines. Initially, orders from above discouraged retreat. Positions were to be held. Ground was not to be given up, but on the battlefield, reality could not be ignored. Gradually, German commanders began to pull their forces back. The retreat, however, was far from organized. Roads were congested with vehicles, some operational, many destroyed or abandoned. Movement was slow and chaotic. Fuel shortages meant that not all equipment could be saved. Difficult decisions had to be made. Tanks and trucks were left behind. Heavy weapons were abandoned. In many cases, soldiers were forced to continue on foot. The cold made everything worse. Temperatures remained below freezing. Snow covered the landscape, slowing movement and draining energy. Soldiers marched for hours, often without adequate food or rest. Wounded men could not always be evacuated. Some were left behind, unable to continue. As German forces attempted to withdraw, Allied troops pressed forward. What had once been an advance was now a struggle for survival. During the retreat, losses increased. Without proper coordination and with constant pressure from Allied forces, German units became vulnerable. Attacks from the air and ground disrupted movement and caused further casualties. Across the Ardennes, the signs of collapse were everywhere. Burned-out vehicles blocked narrow roads. Abandoned equipment lay scattered across the snow. Smoke rose from destroyed convoys. The battlefield, once alive with movement and energy, now told a different story, one of exhaustion and failure. German soldiers, who had entered the offensive with determination, now faced a harsh realization. The offensive had failed, and beyond that, the war itself was slipping beyond recovery. By mid-January, Allied forces had regained much of the territory lost during the initial German advance. The bulge that had appeared in Allied lines was shrinking rapidly. Front lines began to stabilize, but the balance of power had clearly shifted. Germany had committed some of its last reserves to this operation. Tanks, experienced troops, and precious fuel. All had been spent. And in return, they had gained only temporary ground that could not be held. Perhaps the most significant loss was not territory, but control. The initiative was now firmly in Allied hands. From this point forward, Germany would no longer dictate the course of the war. For the soldiers on the ground, this truth became clearer with every passing day. Every abandoned tank, every failed attack, every order to fall back reinforced a single realization. They were no longer fighting to win. They were fighting to survive. As the final days of January approached, the intensity of combat in the Ardennes began to fade. The sounds of constant gunfire and explosions grew less frequent. In their place came an eerie quiet, broken only by the wind moving across the frozen landscape. Beneath the snow lay the remnants of a desperate offensive, shattered equipment, lost lives, and a plan that had failed. The last major German attack in the West had come to an end. And with it, any remaining hope of turning the war around. By the end of January 1945, the Ardennes battlefield had fallen quiet. But the silence carried the weight of failure. What remained was not victory, but the aftermath of a desperate gamble that had cost Germany some of its last strength. The snow-covered forests, once filled with movement and violence, now held abandoned vehicles, broken equipment, and the fading traces of an offensive that had come to nothing. The Battle of the Bulge was over, but for Germany, the consequences were just beginning. The offensive had drained resources that could not be replaced. Tanks had been lost, experienced soldiers killed or captured, and fuel, the most critical element, had been consumed or destroyed. What remained of the German army was weaker, less mobile, and increasingly unable to respond to the growing pressure from Allied forces. On the Western Front, the Allies wasted no time. American and British forces resumed their advance toward Germany. This time, there was no element of surprise, no sudden reversal,